Okay, everyone. So welcome to part 2 of Her Story. We're going to take a dive into, as soon as I can get my slide to change, which it's not doing, there we go. We're going to take a dive into where in the world are we? This is what we would call Mesopotamia, and this area that we see here, I have outlined up here, this is the what they call the Fertile Crescent. The reason why we're visiting here is it kind of, a lot of what the precedence of what I was laying out before in part 1 converges in this part of the world. And it's not that this was the most advanced civilization, although, you know, it's debated in archaeology. I'm not going to get into all of that. But the reason why it's important to focus in this period of time is because this really is where we see the clash. And it's, I think I said this in the last one, it really is represented in the goddess stories from this area where we see the clash of her story and the rise of his story. And part of the reason for that is because writing as we know it today was invented there. And coincidentally, and I would also say unfortunately, it was exactly during this time where we have the civilization of Sumer or Sumeria. It was exactly around this time where we start to see the kind of clash of cultures, where the history that I had laid out before starts to clash with the rise of city-states. And city-states are the model for our civilization, Western civilization, because everything that occurred in here then spreads into Greece and Rome, etc. And this then has become the model for civilization as we know it today. So just to take you through this place a little bit, Sumer is here. This would be the kingdom of Sumer, and then there's an ascendant kingdom out of Sumer, or concurrent and then ascendant, which is when all the wars begin, which is Babylonia. This area of land is quite interesting because this is associated with the Garden of Eden. This is the Dilum land of the Sumerians. And this convergence of these two rivers here, the Tigris and the Euphrates, are in their creation stories, which I think I said something about Namu and Tiamat, the creatress goddesses that are, and in one of these stories, there's the mixing of the sweet water and the bitter water being the salt water and the sweet water, which then causes the beginning of creation. So, this is actually the prototype. Some of these stories, these creation stories from Sumer, is the prototype for what later becomes the Garden of Eden. Sumer here, then there's, as I said, arises concurrent and out of is Babylon, and then Assyria, and then the Phoenicians are also arising at the same time, and they're I wouldn't call it an empire, but their civilization spreads along the coastal areas as the Phoenicians are known as amazing traders and seafarers. And then, of course, we have the rise of the Abrahamic religions, the whole Judeo-Christian, which all of this starts to clash in this area. What we know of Sumer, it comes from this culture, which there's very little known of. But let me tell you, the Ancient Aliens, that's the Ancient Aliens show, they love these people because their pottery all is representative in this form. It's reptilian. And so this Ubaid culture stretches back about 6,000, 5,900 BC, and it's assumed that Sumer, or not assumed, I believe they understand that Sumer arose out of this culture, but they don't know a lot about it. So here, Assyria, Phoenicia, okay. If you hear me use the word Akkadian or Sumerian, these are two languages. One point I want to make about the Ubaids and the Sumerians, they are non-Semitic people. again, of unknown origin. So it's also here where we start to see these would be more associated with the earlier goddess cultures that then start clashing with the Arabic and the Semitic people culturally. All right. So we're going to focus first on Inanna, and Inanna is directly associated with the planet Venus in Sumeria, but rising out of perhaps this earlier Ubaid culture, the first knowledge we have of Inanna is that she's the great great-great-granddaughter of Namu, who is the creatress goddess. And she's also associated with an earlier form name called Nidaba. And what we know of Nidaba is that she was known as the serpent goddess of wisdom. She was the holy cobra. And what's said about Nidaba is that she swims through the reeds long before Sumer was called that name, and that she comes to the land of Sumer from the reeds that she knows so well. And from that, she fashions the stylus to press into the moist clay, giving the gift of civilization. She gives writing and all of the gifts of civilization to Beletzere, who is considered the scribe of the earth, who records the deeds of all of the living on the leaves of the tree of life. And it's Beletzere who advises Erishkigal, who is then the queen of the underworld, of all the living's doings. So to a certain degree, this prototype or this pre-form of Inanna already shows her as Venus bringing the gifts of civilization, which is something that carries cross-culturally all the way to the Mayans and the Aztecs, even though they know her by different names. So destiny becomes associated with her. Now, I'm going to use one of the invocations from Enheduanna, she was a Sumerian high priestess of Ur. Ur and Uruk were two of the first main cities dedicated to Inanna in that area of Sumer that I was talking about. Enheduanna, her works were just recently translated not too long ago into the book is called The Lady of the Largest Heart. She is the first known named authoress or poet, which is quite interesting. And in one of her invocations to Inanna, she says, "To her who appears in the sky, to her who appears in the sky, I want to address my greeting. To the Heridule who appears in the sky, I want to address my greeting. To the great queen of heaven, Inanna, I want to address my greeting. To her who fills the sky with her pure blaze, to the luminous one, to Inanna, as bright as the sun, to the great queen of heaven." Throughout some of these cultures, certainly Inanna here, and then Ishtar and Astarte, which are, again, from the ascendant kingdoms out of Sumeria, Ishtar specifically Babylonian, and Astarte more associated with the Canaanites and Phoenicians. Inanna and Venus are represented as bright as the sun. There's a lot of reference to that, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Excuse me. She's also called the morning and evening star, the first daughter of the moon, the holy shepherdess, and the Heridule of heaven, which I mentioned that in Enheduanna's greeting. A Heridule is a consecrated woman, just as the name Kadesha is the same, and that is consecrated holy woman. Another translation of that is a priestess to that particular goddess that later then became bastardized into sacred prostitute and then demeaned into prostitute, period. But Heridule is associated with sacred, and I mean, using the word prostitute in itself, unfortunately, because of its current usage, makes it sound demeaning, but it wasn't at that time. So the earliest depiction of Inanna we have is not this one, but I'll explain this one later. It's actually an Uruk and it goes back to about 4000 BC. It's a depiction of her on a vase, and it's depicting the sacred marriage rites, which I'm going to talk to you also about in a minute. So Inanna, as a civilizing goddess, Venus as a principle of civilization, Inanna holds the powers of civilization. They're called the MES, M-E-S, or sometimes they're written M-E-H. And it's part of Inanna's gift to the people, just like the earlier form of Nidaba, to bestow these on people and kings alike. They did recognize Venus as both evening and morning star, which gives her a representation of the fertility of the land and the life and power of procreation. She's got some other names. She's called the Queen of Heaven and Earth. She's the light of the world, the righteous judge, the forgiver of sins, the opener of the womb, and the amazement of the land. Inanna is a sexually free goddess, completely bold and completely without fear. If we associate her as, I like to call, again, when we were talking about the inner side of Venus, I like to associate, I like to name them separately. So we have Venus Libra, and then we have Venus Inanna. And Venus Inanna to me represents a lot of the inner side of Venus. Venus is ruler of Taurus. So as Venus Inanna, it also relates to Venus Libra, Venus Aphrodite Libra. She also has the power of allure, the power of magnetism, what we would call the law of attraction. And it's through that she presides over the marriage of the opposites. They recognize these two sides of Venus as morning star and evening star, and in some of the different cultures that at that time, that's where Venus starts to get confusing, or Inanna and her later forms start to get confusing, because sometimes it's referred to as male and sometimes female. So the Sumerians preferred the female Venus in her evening star manifestation, but the Semites, the later Semites, preferred the male form, which is the morning star. And later on, that gets associated with Jesus, by the way, in the Bible. And that morning star manifestation as male is where we can follow that thread clear across the other side of the planet to the Aztecs and the Mayans, who had, Quetzalcoatl or Viracocha or Kukulkan. All three of those have similar stories of being born and dying and then leaving and bringing back civilization, the return of Quetzalcoatl. And they used to wage war on the helical rising of the morning star. So because of this dual nature, she's a paradoxical goddess. Venus is a paradox. This is something that Enid had mentioned before, that we don't focus so much on the inner side of Venus as much as her more known yang form as ruler of Libra. I'm going to talk about that at the end, of how we might interpret her more in the chart as the inner side. So this paradoxical nature also comes up in some of Enhe Joanna's writings, where she talks about her as both a creator and destroyer goddess. So to keep paths and ways in good order and to shatter the earth and to make it firm are yours, Inanna, she says. To turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man are yours, Inanna. Desirability and arousal, goods and property are yours, Inanna. Gain and profit and great wealth and greater wealth, loss and the reduction of wealth are yours, Inanna. So the point is, they have assigned her with opposites, again, because of her representation as morning and evening star. In Sumer, the priestesses ruled over her temples, and the priestesses were also the ones who attended to the ziggurats, which were these large storehouses that held all of the fruits and wealth of the land, the livestock and the grains. And it was actually the priestesses who watched over the fields and all of that, and they counted these things. So there is an assumption somewhere along the line in archaeological thinking that perhaps women and Inanna's priestesses were actually involved in the creation of writing. I mentioned that before, but I didn't give it the name, but I thought you might already know it. It's cuneiform writing. And the reed that Nidaba brings, where they said the stylus, the press into the clay, is what makes the cuneiform characters. So because the priestesses were the ones that were counting the grains and keeping track of that, there's a possible association that it was actually women that invented writing that came out of that. Okay. This is interesting. Back to the idea that Venus appears as the blazing sun. And this is in many of her accounts from that time. And it's not just there. The Mayans and Aztecs talk about this also. It was only recently, and I believe that the scientists at the Max Planck Institute, this little report that I have here, was from like 2013, I think. And what they show is that the solar wind around Venus can actually make it appear comet-like. And the largest one that they recorded at that time is 7,500 miles. So the possibility that Venus actually appeared differently at that time is a theory of a guy named Velikovsky, who has some other theories too. But it's an interesting one to consider, especially when we see pictures like this. Egypt is also a concurrent culture that's arising around the time of Sumer in their own with their own pantheon and their own cosmology, but very similar cosmology. And here we have a depiction of Hathor, the moon, and Isis, also associated with Venus, conferring power, blessings, queenship upon Nefertiti. And this depiction with the feathers, and it later shows up in Sumeria, where some female forms also have beards. Comets were also in Babylon referred to as the bearded ones. So it's possible that, if you look at this picture and this one, it's possible that at some point her appearance was different. And that's also what gave her prominence, which is it's not only just the harmonious movement that she makes astronomically, and her appearance as morning and evening star, and when she goes in the underworld, which clearly shows up in Inanna's myths. Okay. So one of the first full stories that we know about Inanna, and we can get that from extant hymns and different bas reliefs and pottery from the time, is this the Heros Gamos, which is the great marriage, the sacred marriage. Okay, so I put together this slide. I just have to point out, it's interesting. This is an actual picture relief of the sacred marriage, of the rites of the sacred marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi, which I'm going to talk about in a second. This is a plaque of Inanna here, as she's also called Lady of the Beast, with her foot on the lion, and the star is often associated with her. This is her actual symbol in Sumeria. And she's wearing her crown. And this particular thing is the seal. I just want you to remember that, because I'm going to talk about that in a second. But this picture is interesting. I was putting together some of this material like a year or two ago for some other lecture, and I noticed something in my backyard exactly as I was working on this sacred marriage slide. And there were literally, this is a picture from my backyard, I noticed something moving in the grass, and I went out and then I grabbed my camera, and here they are intertwined, and these are two snakes mating in my backyard. So yes, this brings us to the sacred marriage. Like I said, Inanna and her priestesses are personified as the Kadesha, the consecrated feminine form. And widely practiced in her temples was this particular sacred marriage rite. Interesting that also in the temples, hermaphrodite and transgender people were honored. They were held in high esteem, a bit like we see in the indigenous peoples, the native tribes, where they're called two-soul people. And this carries forward also into other cultures, but hermaphroditism, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, it has a profound religious significance to a certain degree because it is the reconciliation of opposites. So we can start to piece together what happened in this HERstory, the sacred marriage. In the hymns, we know that Inanna, the high priestess of Inanna, is being bathed and dressed and adorned in the temple, and her priestesses are going out into the streets with their instruments. The drum is one of them, calling the people to the temple and calling the man, who is then meant to be, only if he's worthy to Inanna, to take part in this sacred marriage rite. So they make this procession through the streets, and there's a whole bunch of celebration, and that is what that first depiction of Inanna I told you about on the Uruk vase from 4000 BC is. It is a depiction of the marriage rites, the procession to Inanna's temple. So then in this story, the specific story that then becomes the model for other stories in that time, Dumuzi is the shepherd that Inanna has chosen as her mate. It's not a permanent mate because, she's, sexually free. But in this myth, she chooses Dumuzi. And so Dumuzi is coming to the door, and Inanna, and this is from the extant hymns, Inanna is saying, "My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven is full of eagerness like the young moon. My untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground?" Now, I want you to remember from part one all of the imagery of vulvas and what that represented. So Dumuzi is outside with the procession, and he's kind of, raising his hand like, me, pick me. And he says, "At the king's lap stood the rising cedar. He has sprouted, he has burgeoned, his lettuce planted by the water. He is the one." And Inanna then says, "He is the one my womb loves the best." So what happens then in the marriage rites, of course, is that Dumuzi is led in, and then they lay in the bed that's been prepared by the priestesses, and the marriage rites happen. Now, on the political level or on the social level, what was recorded, what has been recorded in the list of the kings of Sumer, is that this rite was the making of a king. A king of Sumer could only hold office if he had the title of the En of Uruk, or remember Uruk being Inanna's main city, which is the spouse, which translates to the spouse of Inanna. This particular seal, which is the sun, the moon, and Venus, and if you remember when I was talking about Newgrange, how this has a calendar feature as well, because the irregular, it's not that it's an irregular orbit, but the irregular timing of the sun, the solar year and the lunar year can be rectified by Venus every 8 years, every 40 years. So there's something about this, also the power that she holds, the power of time, the power of keeping time, that she bestows upon Dumuzi in this story, and by that she confers. Now it's interesting because in the earlier recounting of this, she defers upon him, or she confers upon him, the authority to steward the land of the goddess. Kingship is a part of that, but it's not under, it changes. It changes later, which I'll talk about a little bit, but that's where we start to see the kind of clash of the earlier civilizations and their perception of the divine feminine at the center of their civilization. It's only later, the kings of Sumer and Babylon and Assyria start to appropriate Inanna's power for themselves. I mean, it's interesting. Even Julius Caesar tried to claim ancestral relationship to Venus as part of this tradition, right? That's how old this tradition goes. And then later, Louis XIV, borrowing from the pharaohs, tried to make himself a sun god. But it was this tradition. You had to be a spouse of Inanna in order to get this seal, and then this became the ruling seal. So what's the meaning of this intermarriage, this hieros gamos? On one level, this is about fertility rites, and we see this in the pagan traditions, and even what's been passed forward from the Druidic and the Celtic traditions, that it's a theme of in pagan origin of ensuing the fertility of the land where the god and goddess unite. It also becomes, as you'll see in the next story, where the vegetative god is the sacrificial god. He is sacrificed also for the fertility of the land. He's killed and reborn. And it's interesting, though, that Jesus becomes a later example of this, but with different overlays. Rather than to give fertility to the land, he died for our sins to give us eternal life. But that also is borrowed from the next story. So another layer of meaning here is, as I was saying before, within Venus itself is the principle of opposites and the reconciliation of those opposites. It's through her conference of power and this relates to why the king then is able to steward over her land, because she has civilized him through the act of this sacred marriage. She has conferred her light to him. There's a later story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the first hero's journey. And Gilgamesh has this little sidekick called Enkidu, who's he's the wild primal man. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they actually send Enkidu to Inanna's temples to become civilized. And he sleeps with the priestesses for 7 days, and that's how they clean him up, they educate him, they civilize him by having these sacred marriage rites with him. So it was a big part of their culture. It reminded me of course, what we're talking about here is Tantra, right? And there's an Indian mystic, Rabindranath Tagore, I hope I say his name correctly, and this is a quote from him where he talks about the power of Shakti. He says, Shakti is the power of the feminine. If Shakti disappears, the creative force in society is inhibited. The men lose their virility and become mechanical in their actions. This vital force of creative feminine power, when it's missing, life becomes meaningless, right? And if you remember from part 1, where I had that picture of the woman's, the kind of woman goddess standing there with the cord coming out of her vulva to the man's bow. And it was like she was conferring a power to him, a virility, a fertility, while he was hunting. It was like the goddess or the feminine giving power. This is what they're talking about. On a very interesting, on a mundane level, or on a practical level, Venus as ruler of Taurus also points to that which we give meaning to, which then becomes something that we value. So as this inner side of Venus, it's hence why the devaluation of the feminine can leave our society so bereft of creative options and meaning. Like Tagore say, men lose their virility and become mechanical in their actions if this Shakti is driven from the land. So yes, as I was saying, these are the tantric mysteries. It's already inherent within the two sides of Venus. It points specifically to the unification of the male and the female. And like I said, the hermaphrodite that's held also holy and sacred in her temple is held that way because within that, by the blending of genders, we already see the unification of what's seemingly opposite, of irreconcilable things. It doesn't matter whether those things are male or female or life or death. So Venus itself then is not just the force of uniting, but she is the very principle of that. Applying this in a psychological, spiritual sense, of course, relates to Jung and the great work, the alchemical work, the anima and the animus, which is on the psychological level, the male encountering his own anima, his own inner feminine, which Jung equates to the soul, the feminine, the female encountering and integrating her animus, which also equates to a way that she then receives wholeness in the world. In alchemy, they talk about a secret fire, which corresponds to, and remember I had it on the serpent slide in part 1, corresponds to the kundalini, the serpent power here. So in alchemy, we have the turning base matter into gold, right? That's a psycho-spiritual process. It could be understood as a psychological spiritual process. Like in alchemy, just like in yoga, there are a pair of opposites. There's the king and the queen, the Shiva and the Shakti, the god and the goddess, joined together in sacred marriage as part of the work of that process, or as a demonstration of the work of that process. In the yogic system, they have the two channels. This can be kind of a representation of that run up the human spine through the chakra system, the Ida and the Pingala associated with the sun and the moon. And the central channel here is the, excuse me, the Sushumna. And it's considered the harmonizing channel, the conduit. And the Sushumna is also associated with illumination, because as the Ida and Pingala rise from the base chakra up into the Kepler, the crown chakra here, this is how illumination happens. This is the process of enlightenment, and it happens through the central channel. So the central channel is a mediator, a transference of power, again, from the lower to the higher. And both Mercury, in alchemy specifically, Mercury is this mediator, but both Mercury and Venus represent this mediating principle, right? And both are associated with illumination. So as these twin serpents twine together, we see it also in the caduceus. A third thing is born. Enlightenment happens out of this this congregation, out of this conjugation. What is being created is the immortal body of light. And I think I said something about this in part 1, where I equate Venus as ruler of Taurus as the etheric body. It is the energetic template for the physical body. It's the primary base, the energy body, which is the base matter of which the physical body manifests from. So the process of enlightenment here is going to have to involve the body, right? It's not something we do today, but because we've lost a lot of that, we've been cut off from our bodies. But the point is the illumination of the light body that illuminates the physical body through action within the physical body here, its conjugation, it is part of this process. It's part of this process of the revelation of light and matter. Okay, before I go to the next slide, I'm just going to stop and see if there was any questions bubbling up over there. Okay, good.
Doesn't look like there are any right yet.
Okay, good. Okay, so now on to the next main component of Venus Inanna's mythology. Venus's journey to the underworld. I'm sure most people here know that. I am going to recount it for the purposes of then being able to unpack it and explain some of the different levels of the meaning of that. So certainly Inanna's myth is a prototype that we see show up later, like in the Greco-Roman Persephone, Pluto, Demeter thing, Demeter stories. And what we catch a glimpse of that comes out of this tradition and then is also carried forward in the Greek tradition is the Eleusinian mysteries, of which they know they were enacted, but nobody really knows anything about, because upon the pain of death, they were told never to reveal them, the initiates, and they didn't. So what we know of them, though, there's a few little whispers, there's leaks, right? What we do know is that one of the initiates had said that one loses all fear of death after going into the going through the Eleusinian mysteries. Again, I want you to keep in mind that, like I had said before, the story of myth is only the surface layer. The progressive enactment of the myth, the enactment of the myth through ritual, of which the Eleusinian mysteries were, and quite possibly Inanna's descent story is also this, as I said, the earlier prototype to that. It's through the enactment of that, the progressive initiations, that the depth of the myth gets revealed, but it's only revealed to the initiates. And they also go through their own process as they realize it as they go through the initiations. So Inanna's descent story starts with the phrase, "She opened her ear to the great below." And she says she's going to the funeral of the bull of heaven, which is her sister Erishkigal's husband. Erishkigal is a goddess of the underworld. So Inanna she confers with some of the other gods, and they're all telling her, no, don't do it. You're crazy. Don't go. Why are you going? They don't understand why she's going. But she had opened her ear to the great below, and she was determined to go. So she gets all, and at this point, Inanna is known as a queen of heaven and earth. So she has all of the powers of civilization, and she gathers them all. They say she took the 7 divine powers and she grasped them, and then she puts on various implements that represent these divine powers, some of them being lapis beads. People have made correlations to the chakras, which is quite possible that this is also a transmission of that knowledge, like I had before, the slide, the awakening of the Kundalini that was in the Tantric traditions is also in this story. It's quite possible that that's there, because she does place these 7 objects on the different parts. Like here, this is not a picture of her doing that. This is a cylinder seal after she's done the descent journey, which actually shows her as the passageway between the lower world, this would be the terrestrial world, and the upper world. And as I pointed out before, Venus is the shamanka. She is the tree of life. the passageway between the worlds, and her underworld journey is part of how she creates that opening. So she gathers all of these things. Here on her head is what's called the Shigura crown, and it's made up of horns. Remember when I was talking about Venus as ruler of Taurus and the horned goddesses? This is a representation of that. So she has the Shigura crown on, and she puts on her beads, and this is interesting. This is in the text. She puts mascara on her eye, which is called "Let a Man Come," let him come, and then she pulls on her breastplate called "Come, Man, Come," and she puts it over her breast, and then she puts on her ring, and she holds the measuring rod and the measuring line, and she goes to the underworld. So before she goes, she told her faithful servant, Ninshabar, that if she doesn't come back, that maybe Ninshabar needs to make some actions and and go and get her. She's aware of the peril of what it is to go into the underworld. So she stopped going, and she has to, recite these different things. And there are 7 gates to the underworld, which also correlate to the 7 powers that she's bringing with her, all of her earthly and queenly power. And at each gate, she stopped, and she must give up one of these powers in order to pass through that gate. And when she finally arrives in the underworld, she's been stripped naked, and there she is naked before Erishkigal. And Erishkigal is raging. She's, this primal, fierce force of feminine underworld power. And she fastens, it actually happens quite quickly, she fastens the eye of death on Inanna, and she speaks the word of wrath against her. She strikes her, and Inanna is turned into a corpse. So Inanna dies. She's hung on what they say a nail or a hook for 3 days. This is going to start to sound familiar to you. The elements of this story are already there. Which, by the way, goes back earlier than 2000 BC. This story, even though this is a cylinder seal representation, could probably be dated to about 4000 BC, maybe even earlier. So she hangs there for 3 days. And so Ninshabar in the upper world starts, in the terrestrial world, kicks into action seeking help. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but she goes to different gods, and they were like, well, we told her not to go, and no. Finally, she gets Enki, who is the god of wisdom, Inanna's brother. And Enki agrees, and he creates these 2 beings called the Kugara, from dirt under his fingernails, and he sends them, instructs them. He gives them the water. I'm trying to remember, the bread and the water of life, and he instructs them to only leave the underworld with Inanna's corpse, not to take any gifts from Ereshkigal, and he also instructs them that whatever Erishkigal says, they're supposed to repeat it. So these little beings go down, and Erishkigal is there, and she's slapping her thigh, and she's ripping at herself, and she's like, and they say in the myth, in the extant hymn, she's like a woman in labor, crying in pain, and she's going, oh, my insides, oh, my outsides. And every time she does that, the little Kugara just go, oh, my insides, oh, my outsides. And eventually, Erishkigal is placated, she's appeased, and she offers them different things, which they demurely, say, no, thank you. And then finally, she gives them Inanna's corpse. And they sprinkle the bread and the water of life on the corpse, and then they're allowed to leave. Inanna's resurrected. So then they get to the upper world, but there's a cost because these demons follow Inanna, and they're told that she must give a replacement. And those of you that know the kind of Persephone story might also recognize, like I said in the beginning, this predates that. It's a prototype for that story also. So Inanna's got to find a replacement, and then there's a whole bunch I'm not going to get into. They want her handmaiden, ninja bar, then her beautician, and then her baker. And anyway, every time she comes upon them, the interesting part of the story is that they say they were wearing sackcloth and they were properly mourning her loss. So they say, no, not them. Until she comes upon her shepherd king, Dumuzi, who's sitting on his throne, probably like laying back, eating some grapes and enjoying all of his kingly power, which she gave him, not missing her at all. So she fixes the eye of death upon him and points to him and says, him. And so the demons grab him and he goes into the underworld. There's more to the story there because he tries to run away and then different stuff happens. But the point is, at one point, Inanna grieves him, and so Dumuzi is allowed to come up for 6 months of the year, and his sister, Gestiana, which some scholars often say is actually an aspect of Inanna and may not actually be separate, also takes place in the underworld. So very much like the Persephone story that we know later. And again, like I said, this is also carrying these earlier pagan traditions, carrying that vegetative rebirth. So the dying vegetative god is then reborn, and then the spring comes and all of that. Okay, so what does this mean now? So on the psycho-spiritual level, or even in the spiritual level, when Venus arises, when Inanna arises out of the underworld, she is now the consummate unifying force between the upper, lower, and middle worlds. Like I said, she is then the shamanka. She has demonstrated through her myth the principle of life and death and resurrection. She has also demonstrated in this myth how the ego self, which belongs to the middle world, to the terrestrial world, where you and I are residing right now, how the ego self, when it unites with soul, because in the Sumerian, as in many indigenous traditions, souls, when they die, go to the underworld. Ego is uniting with soul, which then births spirit, right? So it births this passageway to the upper world. This is a story of a unification of the lower and higher natures. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, this is also, it's the heroine's journey, which predates the hero's journey. Like I said, Gilgamesh's story is concurrent with this in oral tradition. Is later and then concurrent in oral tradition, and then much later in written tradition. So the heroine's journey is, another way of saying that is, what are the feminine sacred mysteries? Because this is what Inanna is the holder of. So what her myth is teaching us is a bit about descent to our dissociated parts, right? And that descent takes courage. And it takes a willingness to, important in the Sumerian story, to listen and to hear the rumblings of what's below the earth, right? i.e. one's subconscious, because her story opens with, she opens her ear to the great below. But in Sumerian, what's really interesting is that the word for ear and wisdom is the same, right? So listening and hearing is and it's interesting because these are both still associated with the planet Venus as ruler of Libra and Taurus, listening and hearing, right? The ability to listen to somebody, but then are you really hearing them, right? So this is Venus in her inner and outer form. if we listen with wisdom, then we're listening with understanding, the understanding of all things. And this is part of why Inanna had to make this descent. She had to go to the great below to get the wisdom of the underworld mysteries. She was already the queen of heaven and earth, right? But in a way, she was uninitiated in the deeper mysteries. In Jungian language, this would be the process, what he outlined in the process of individuation and the birth of what I call there's the little s self and the big S self. And that the big S self, or archetype of self, as Jung talked about it, is birthed or is realized through the process of individuation. Part of that process is descent. The little beings are interesting in that they represent also another layer of Venus that we know today, listening and hearing, but also mirroring. Because what they do to Erishkigal is when she's going, oh, my insides, and they're, oh, my insides, they're actually demonstrating this, a principle of the reconciliation of that which has been disowned. Right? We need to listen to it. We need to, and mirroring is compassion, right? So there's a compassion, and Erishkigal responds to that compassion, just as our own disowned parts do. So as Inanna here is this shamanka between the worlds, and I talk about the three worlds. I talked about them in the last slide as, in traditional shamanism, the lower world, the upper world, and the middle world. There is a psychological correlation we can give to that of soul, ego, soul, and spirit. Inanna's story in her descent also, and her resurrection, points to a huge, larger principle, a creation of the cosmos, the creation of humanity itself, that the descent of spirit into soul into ego is the process of the involution, the movement away from the divine. That's how we come into being. Evolution is the reverse process, where ego then rectifies itself to soul, then rectifies itself to spirit. Right? So Inanna's journey is showing us, and this is where in our archaic ancestors' thinking, in their cosmology and their understanding, the feminine was the way shower. It's only later she gets demonized in the Judeo-Christian traditions, because the descent, the involution away from the divine, is exactly how evolution happens. But the Judeo-Christian traditions cut it off there, and earth and everything that belongs to it then is no longer sacred. So the process of coming into sacred life is then demonized, and woman along with it, because she is, like I said before, her womb is the crucible for where ego, soul, and spirit combine to create the human form. So with their demonization of earth and earthly pleasures and all of those things, this way shower aspect of the divine feminine is lost. So she's demonized, cut off from that power, and then it's only the ascent that the male god then represents in the later traditions. But in this tradition, we see it in its wholeness here. And again, the thing that we miss is because human thinking tends to get more linear, and we are very linear today, rationalistic, etc. And in our archaic ancestors' consciousness, it was much more what's the word I want to say, able to hold paradox, as we see in Inanna's representation itself. Not only hold paradox, but to hold the cycles of things. The cyclical keeping of time is a representation of this that we see in the ancient world that we don't have today. Repeated locking cycles of time, interlocking with each other, no ending, no beginning, life, death, rebirth, etc., etc. So this cyclical thinking is also something that gets cut off. A kind of pattern of wholeness gets cut off when the hero's journey overrides the heroine's journey. I mean, it's obvious that we can't have resurrection without death, right? You can't have enlightenment without darkness. It's like Jung said, we don't become enlightened by imagining beings of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So in this underworld journey, eradication, to a certain degree, represents everything that's been outcast. It's everything that's in your subconscious, i.e. your shadow, right? And when your shadow is not owned, when your shadow, anything that's dissociated from one's own consciousness, because as I said, her journey represents a pattern of wholeness, just like the sacred marriage is the reconciliation of opposites within you. This descent journey is the reconciliation of that which has been disowned and cast into the shadow. And when something is disowned in the human psyche, it becomes, it becomes a lot more horrible than it actually is. Our own shadow is something that we have a lot of shame and fear around. But it festers in the rejection of the darkness, just like Erishkigal. She's rageful, but when the little beings mirror her, they listen to her, they hear her, then things are able to be reconciled. Resurrection happens. So this is illustrating that within the shadow there's a primal power that must be reowned. I know this from doing shadow work. It's terrifying work to do, to go through your deepest, darkest fears, the most repugnant qualities that you want to project onto others. By the way, projection is a part of Venus's ruler of Libra. Just look at relationships. Need I say more? How much we project onto our partners. No, it's them, Okay, so as her rulership there, that's part of what she's about and part of what we try to disentangle ourselves from in relationship. So when we can reconcile that shadow part of ourselves, there's a primal power that's released in it. There's a potentiality we didn't know we had. But it takes the kind of courage that Inanna had going to the underworld, to face that, to uncover the shadow and then to reconcile it within one's own psyche, births something else. It births an unexperienced, like I said, a potential inner resource, Taurus, think Taurus, and then a third thing is born out of that concourse. Okay. So, the other layer of this, again, thinking of Venus as ruler of Taurus, is that she leaves behind all of her symbols of power, and we know how Taurus can be so possessive, right? Never wants to give up. Out of my cold, dead hooves, you'll pry that. And Inanna is forced to give up, to get whatever this prize is that she's so drawn to, because she has put her ear to the great below, and she can't not take the initiation. She's so drawn to it. She is in a shamanic initiation. So she has to leave all those things behind. Clearly, this is showing us what happens in shamanic initiation, where we go through this psychological descent into the unconscious, sometimes into madness, sometimes into psychosis. There's a disassembling of the psyche to then be reassembled. I could say a lot more about that, because Isis is also a representation of Inanna Venus, and it's Isis that reassembles the dismembered parts of Osiris to bring him back to life. So, and that myth also correlates to this one. So to a certain degree, we have to give up our terrestrial power and the things that we hold on to dearly to make that kind of descent. You know, I've recently been plunging into Jung's Red Book, which is his descent journey. He goes through psychosis. He goes through a shamanic initiation. You know, he thinks he's going crazy. I mean, the Red Book is really an incredible look at, because he illustrated his own journeys into his own collective and individuated unconscious and his own madness, and then how he kind of reconciled it within his own psyche. And, you know, he gets into all of the alchemy, all of this stuff that I'm talking about. It's in Jung's Red Book, and also shows how he developed a lot of his theories. You can see them as he's illustrating the journeys that he took that he felt were driving him into madness. You can see where he developed the anima-animus theory and the individuation and all of that. Okay, I digress. I have one more point I want to make about this before I move on. Just want to see if anybody, okay, that's not a question. Okay, the other point of Inanna's underworld journey is that I believe, after studying several myths, and specifically the concurrent Egyptian myth at the time, that this is also contains elements of a mortuary afterlife teaching. And, you know, you may or may not know, and I'm not going to get into it, but the Egyptians had, as we know, they were a mortuary culture. They were a death culture. But all of those rites, you know, that were written in the coffins and in the sarcophagi and in all of the tombs, all of those rites that were written there are, the collected works of those are called the Egyptian books of the dead. There is no one book of the dead. There's all of these writings compiled, and they're instructions for the afterlife, which then is also picked up by the Tibetan Buddhists in the Bardo Tedol, which is their version of the instructions for the afterlife. So in essence, and tell me, I'm totally not getting into the Egyptian books of the dead, but in essence, this appears also to be a kind of mortuary teaching that is echoed in the Egyptian books of the dead. And just in brief, in the Egyptians' belief, there's many parts of the soul, but primary ones, the Ba and the Ka soul, separate at death. There's more than that. But part of the whole point of the Egyptian books of the dead and all the rites and all the instructions for the afterlife are that so the person who's journeying in the afterlife can unite the Ba and the Ka soul in the afterlife, which then creates the Ak soul, which is the vehicle for immortality, right? Let me unpack that a little bit. Again, it's the light body. It's the light body that was in the Heroes Gamos, right? That's being enlightenment causes one to become immortal because you've then transcended time. So it's the same in the afterlife traditions of this time in Sumerian Egypt, and it's in indigenous cultures in the U.S. also that I'm not going to get into, but this is all over the world. There is this belief of these many parts of the soul that need assistance after death to reunite. When they reunite in the afterlife or can be caused to reunite, then this third thing is born again, the Ak soul to the Egyptians, that is the carrier for one's immortality. That's what they were doing with the pharaohs, because they, you know, these elaborate mortuary and mummification and all of that was about assisting them to create the Ak soul in the afterlife. So that in essence, if we go to the Buddhists, we can see who were concurrent with this also. We can see that it's the creation of losing it, the light body enlightenment that then causes one to be able to break the wheel of rebirth, right? One then masters birth, death, rebirth, one is liberated. That would be in the Tibetan language, what they would say. So enlightenment, liberation, the unification of the Ba and the Ka soul in the afterlife also confers immortality. They're all saying the same thing in slightly different language. And all of the later traditions arose out of all of these concurrent teachings. So in that way, again, when we think about Venus as ruler of Taurus, we very much are bringing in the Scorpio polarity, just like all the archetypes are like that. You can't hang out just on one side of the archetype if you really want to understand it, because it is always drawing from the other side. Okay, any questions? Oh, by the way, Taurus Scorpio is very closely associated with Egypt and all of these rites I was just talking about.
Well, it looks like no one's got questions.
Okay, good. All right, so just looking at time. Oh, good. All right, so this is a relief. It's called the Burney relief. It was dated somewhere around, this is later, of course. It was found in Babylon, or traced supposedly to be found in Babylon. And it's kind of hotly debated. Most people go with it. It's Inanna. Some say it's Lilith. My understanding of this, again, from my own kind of cross reading, referencing different sources, is I would say this is Inanna in her descended form. Now, when we talk about ancient gods and goddesses, and you talk about even in the Greco-Roman myths where we see so much syncretization of one form of a goddess into another, and then, there's an aspect of the god or goddess that's separate, but it's really them. So, it doesn't really matter to a certain degree, but the symbolism that's here is very Inanna after she's descended to the underworld. If Lilith is an aspect of Inanna is another question. From Sumeria, we don't know a lot about Lilith. She doesn't show up in any extensive writing until the Judaic Midrash texts, which are like, the Middle Ages or something. The early centuries. So the only accounting we know of Lilith is in the next myth I'm going to tell you. She's mentioned, and in another reference where she's considered the hand of Inanna. So she could be associated with the powers of those priestesses that go out into the streets to call the men in or call the people into the temple. As hand of Inanna, she can also be associated with a primordial feminine force, which lies behind Inanna herself. So, having dispelled that, I'm going to use this just a little bit to talk about Inanna as the descendant, and maybe in this form we could say she's united with her Lilith powers. Here, this is what they were talking about. She doesn't have all of her mess of civilization here, but she has the Shigara crown, and this around her neck is another symbol. The downward pointing wings are an image of an underworld goddess. In Sumeria, in the earlier tablet I showed you, she had her wings outstretched. That's a heavenly or terrestrial goddess in their iconography. Downward pointing wings are underworld goddesses, as is this, the feet of the underworld. This is her syncretization with the Anzu bird, which is another being that I'm not going to talk much about, but is also associated with wisdom, as we know the owls are, and in our current understanding of owls, we can take that they're underworld birds. They fly between the worlds, in totemic medicine. They're able to see between the worlds, and they have this great wisdom of darkness because they can see in the darkness. These, again, there's a few different interpretations of what they are. they're kind of similar to the Ankh, which is an image of immortality. In Shan, it's the Shan or the Ankh. They also are, because in the descent myth, like we heard, she gathered the line and the cord. So this may be what's called the lapis measuring line and cord. And this is the tool that was used for building temples. In Egypt, they had a ritual called the stretching of the cord, which measures the temple. And it's carried forward in Masonic traditions, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. It is the specific alignment of the cord and the use of this line and cord. Again, remember, we're talking about the foundation of what we would call civilization, right? The cornerstone of what we would call civilization. So these temples built using this line and cord are used to create the sacred geometry, to align the dimensions of the building with the stars and the different cardinal directions, etc. That's all this symbol can represent, the powers of that, all of the powers of that, sacred geometry, archaeoastronomy, what I talked a little bit about in part 1. The lions, they're also looking in 2 different directions. Part of what we have going on in this era, which I think is on no, it's not on my next slide. I think it's a slide later, is going to show you we also have a turning of the ages going on here. So the lions can also represent that, looking in the 2 different directions. But that also is a representation of the looking in the 2, again, movement between the worlds, Venus as Shamanka. That can travel between the worlds. Okay, so get to my next slide. All right, here in this story is where we really see, from the Sumerian into the Babylonian context, the rising of the battle between the divine feminine and the arising kings and city-states. So in this story, which goes back to creation story a little bit, because it references, it's Inanna and the Hulupu tree. I'm just trying to think of how much I want to reference that. It's this story as we know it in its entirety is a later written version, which is why it's not so concurrent with what might be understood as the oral traditions, because it's written in Akkadian, which is Babylonian, and so we know it's a later version, and it appears in the tablets of part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So there's some contradictions within it, but this is what happens with myth as time goes on. It gets rewritten to fit the politics and the political happenings of its time. So there's already this kind of demotion of the goddess going on here. But in the beginning of the myth, we have Inanna, who rescued the Hulupu tree at the beginning of time when everything was needful and nothing had yet come forth. And so Inanna takes the Hulupu tree and she plants it in her garden. This is, again, the association of the goddess with the world tree. And that garden is that land that I was talking about in between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so she tends to it, and she's thinking when it grows, she's going to make a wedding bed out of it, etc., etc. In this tree, there is a Anzu bird, which is sitting in the branches with its young. There is what's called a spirit demon, a Lilith, that lives within the trunk of the tree, and a serpent at its base. In this story, Inanna finds them living in her tree, and she gets shocked, and she cries out for help like, "Oh, Gilgamesh, help me! Poor Inanna, I can't, this is not the Inanna we know of the earlier myths, right? It's completely overwritten. And she cries out, and Gilgamesh comes storming in, and he kills the snake, and the Anzu flies away with its young, and Lilith smashes her house in the tree and flees to the wasteland in fury. And then Gilgamesh uproots and cuts up the tree. He gives it to Inanna to make a throne and a bed. And then I think there's something that Inanna gives him, which they never really have been fully able to translate, the puku and the miku. They think it might be this line, this measuring line, and the drum, which Gilgamesh doesn't handle very well because he accidentally drops it into the underworld, and that becomes part of Gilgamesh's whole story. So what we have happening here is, again, in this later story, this later recounting, which is the fullest written recounting we have of the story, coming from the later Babylonian, the goddess here is being, the goddess as the way shower between the worlds, the power of that, and what she represented as the reconciler of those worlds, and the one who is, through her and through the divine feminine creative power, is how all of kingship happens. So it's all being changed here. The tree of life has been uprooted by Gilgamesh, and Inanna, in this increasingly patriarchal culture, is now kind of, she just becomes part of the furniture. You know, she's like domesticated for breeding purposes here. Part of what happens at this time is we have the rising, because this is also concurrent with the rising of the Judeo-Christian mythology, is that what I was talking about before, the archaic consciousness that could hold the reconciliation of opposites and be okay with it. It didn't have to be logical, linear, and rational. This emerging culture, right, the Semitic culture, doesn't seem to be able to do that. So they have to separate things into very separate functions. So what happens here is that it's very, you know, you can't be the prostitute and the demon at the same time, right? You can't be the sacred prostitute, and so they have to separate them. And this is where we really start to see this kind of, not just the marginalization and demonization of women, but the separation of paradoxes, so that they can now be under, you know, whatever, taken apart, the ancient mysteries taken apart, so that they can be understood. I mean, it is, of course, control, because now the priests are taking over the goddesses' temples. This Hulupu tree story, of course, shows up later in the Bible with Eve and the snake and all of that, and that's a very distorted version of this, of Inanna as the tree of life, or even Lilith as the indwelling wisdom, the combination of the serpent and the Anzu bird at in its branches, and the indwelling spirit, the primordial feminine that lives within the tree of life, that's all just decimated. Gilgamesh, is not known if he's a historical mythic figure or a combination of both, because he is listed in the Record of Kings. So we don't know, but here begins the beginning of the hero's journey, which I'm not going to get into because that's a whole other long story. What we do, like I mentioned before, what we do know of Lilith is her representation in this story, but by then she's already a demoness, and Inanna herself is dissociated from her. The three, the snake, the Lilith demon, and the tree, or spirit in the tree. Lilith, by the way, is like Lilitu, which in the earliest translation is a spirit of the wind. It's a spirit of the air. It doesn't have a demonic association until much later. And then the Anzu bird is a triple goddess. What you see there is a representation of triple goddess. And the unfortunate part of this is that Inanna is already dissociated from her kind of triune power in this myth. Okay. So let me just show you a little bit about timing. Oops, I need to move something here. Okay. We're not going to this. I just want to show you that where we are in a timeline, just so you can see it for yourself. Here we're in the, and again, this depends on which scholar you talk to, and it also relates to the Vedas and which Vedic scholar you talk to as far as what are the exact astrological ages. But here we have the age of Taurus, which is around this time, if you remember, from the Ubaid culture coming into the Sumerian culture, and the earliest stories of Inanna around this time in the Uruk phase. Where the great marriage rites are. Here is where Gilgamesh's hero's journey is only known as an oral tradition, and then it's passed, but then here we're starting to shift into the age of Aries, right? Because remember that the astrological ages go backwards on the wheel, the zodiac wheel. So the passage from the age of Taurus to the age of Aries, I mean, do you see what's going on here? Between Inanna's stories and then the rising of the hero's journey, who seizes the power to become king himself, rather than the consort to the feminine and the receiving of her powers of civilization and stewardship, right? Here we had a shepherd king, Dumuzi, right? And then now we started to remember when I was talking about war, war is only kind of really organized war is only kind of forming around here, and now we have the rise of all of the warring that goes on in this area, which is still going on in that geographic area, and then the rise of the Abrahamic religions also happening in this era, and then the stories of the Bible. I just wanted to give you that overview. This dynasty of Akkad, of Sargon the Great, this was Enheduanna's periods that I talked about, where she kind of resurrected not that Inanna was widely worshipped at the time, even in her later forms, or definitely in her later forms at the time, but she was part of a resurgence of Inanna at the time. She was the daughter of Sargon the Great. Okay. So back to our three goddesses. I'm not going to talk about Ishtar much because Ishtar very much carries, well, she's a lot like Inanna, and she has a consort. His name is Tammuz, and she has a descent journey and all. There's not a lot of distinction, except that she's the Babylonian Akkadian version. Astarte, who is sacred to the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, is interesting to focus on because it's through Astarte that the Phoenicians then carry into Greece and Rome, where she becomes Aphrodite, Venus. That's the little remnant that follows out of this area. So the era here for Astarte, the Canaanite Phoenicians, were somewhere around 1500, 2000 BC, all the way up to 300 BC. So Astarte is one of the three Canaanite goddesses that they're condemned for following her in the Bible. It's all over the Bible, the struggle that the Israelites have with the Canaanites. And FYI, in case you haven't noticed, that battle is still going on. I'm not taking sides, but the Palestinians claim lineage to the Canaanites. So they would say they are the original Canaanites. So the Canaanites here are this goddess-worshipping people, and they clash with a lot of the prophets of the Bible. King Solomon was David's son, who gets into trouble in the Bible because he's building a temple to Astarte. and Asherah, who's another form of her, yet may also be a separate goddess. That's another story. And much to the displeasure of Yahweh, he's building this temple to Astarte. You know, this is the King Solomon. And then he later builds Solomon's temple, or Solomon's temple later gets consecrated to house the Ark of the Covenant, which, if you don't know, the Ark of the Covenant contains the light of what? If you remember, it's Shekinah. Shekinah is the light of Venus. You know, it'll all start making sense to you. This ancient, you know, Moses was said to cause the light of Shekinah to manifest in the Ark of the Covenant. In the Christian counterpart, we would say this is the Holy Spirit. And even in the Temple of Solomon, there was an ancient rite. It probably wasn't enacted as directly as it was in Inanna's temples, but there's a mystic tradition within Solomon's temple of the sacred marriage of Metatron and Shekinah, which then it's their celestial marriage. So that carried forward all this time, and is still trying to hold on while while they're being persecuted. So the Hebrews, to a certain degree, inherited the Sumerian rites through Abraham, and Moses kind of carried the Egyptian mystery rites. They were, you know, there's early Semitic priests that were influenced by the Canaanites. Solomon, like I said, being one of them. There's an interesting passage in the Bible that, again, then this is much later, 600 BC, but this is where all this stuff is going on, all the clashing. My goddess, no, my monotheistic God, and, you know, all of that going on. And the Canaanites have this response to Jeremiah in the Bible, and this is from the Old Testament, where Jeremiah is rebuking them for worshiping their goddess. And this is the passage. This is their response. The Canaanites are saying, "As for the message you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we are not going to listen to you." I find that funny. I laugh every time I read that. We are not going to listen to you, but rather we will certainly carry out every word that has proceeded from our mouths by burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, just as we ourselves, our forefathers, our kings, and our princes did in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food and were well off and saw no misfortune. But since we stopped burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything, and we have met our end by the sword and by famine. So this is the kind of last cry of the goddess cultures there, the ones that were attuned to the abundance of the land. And here we have the rise of organized male creator god religions clashing, and the birth of war, of organized war as a function of civilization. I mean, that is the point that I hope you really take away from this, right? 500,000 years of history, 6,000 years of war. That you know, this isn't the only model for civilization just because that's what we know. So Astarte also in the Hebrew in the Bible, her Hebrew name is Ashtoreth, and this is interesting because in the Bible and man, when you talk about propaganda and how, you know, a little twist of a fact, talk about fake news. They took Astarte's name and they conjugated it with the verb bosheth, which means shame, and her name became Ashtaroth, which later becomes a demon and is a high demon in the medieval grimoire later. But there you have it. That was the last remnant of the goddess of the Canaanite and Phoenician people, holding her sacred. And they, in order to, you know, really squish her, they take her name because her priestesses then at that moment become prostitutes, because the priestesses of Astarte are then conjugated with shame. And you know, the rest is history. I don't even know what more there is to say about that. The rest is history. So Astarte does become syncretized later into the Greco-Roman Aphrodite Venus, but this is what I was saying at the beginning of my talk. She's already hot, you know, the Venus Aphrodite that we know today, and even in the older Greek, she's already patricized by then. She's already stripped of a lot of this depth of meaning that we know her from her ancient forms. Okay. Any questions? No?
Nope.
Good. Okay, good. This is just, I like this just for the graphic, not because it's, you know, it's a little current, not all that current. Because I just wanted to illustrate, I'm sure you all know this about Venus, the planet, and that in its, you know, in its synodic movement around the sun, that when she comes to inferior conjunction here, this happens, you know, every in 5 times in every 8-year cycle, that she forms this pentacle in the sky. The association with Venus and the pentagram is where we start to pick her up in the mystical traditions. Like I said, they all went underground. All of the mysteries of Solomon's temple and all of the goddess traditions go underground now. But they are carried forward in remnants that we can pick up in the Western mystery traditions. And here we have the pentacle, which we know the pentagram becomes a central image in, or a central symbol in magical traditions. And this is just a short quote from Eliphas Levi, who is talking about in the Gnostic schools, the pentagram is called the blazing star. It's the sign of intellectual omnipotence and autocracy, concentrated supreme power. So it has 2 sides. Again, think of Venus, 2 sides of Venus. It's the sign of the Word made flesh, but according to the direction of its points, it can either represent order or chaos, the divine lamb of Ormuz or the accursed goat of Mendes. It's either initiation or profanation. It's either Lucifer or Vesper. Then he says the star of morning or evening. Again, this Lucifer also didn't always have that negative connotation, but that's another story. So in magical tradition, let me break this down for you. The upward pointing pentacle and the downward pointing pentacle generally denote the difference between white magic and black magic. In magical practice, it's understood that the same energy that can be used for good can be used for ill. It's an impartial quantitative energy that just flows in the universe, and it can be channeled for good or ill. To a certain degree, the upward pointing triangle is taking the energy here and funneling it down, but the point is in the higher realms. So this is saying thine will be done, right? This is an alignment of all of the lower or baser aspects of one's own nature going through initiations to the higher so that the divine can work through that person. They are in the funnel of divine power. And to a certain degree, the downward pointing triangle is then placing will. For example, the pentagram is also associated with the idea that light is brought into form, which is the basis of magic. And it's through the manipulation or the cooperation with that, through one's will, that magic happens, right? I hope you caught that. It's through the manipulation or cooperation. This represents my will be done because the point is down here in matter, and it's taking divine power and focusing it through personal will. So the simple division between these 2 pentangles and the working of white and black magic is simply this. thine will be done, higher will be done, or my will be done, right? Another way of putting it is that it's either about the power of love, the unifying principle, that everything we were just talking about, why Venus gets associated with love and the goddess of love. But when we look at love as a magical principle, it's the uniting principle, right? Here's Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. This is the perfected human form. So through the initiation in the pentangle, the perfection of form happens. Again, like I said, the revelation of light and matter with the intent of ascent. So all of that work is done in concordance with higher will as opposed to personal will, where all of that energy is channeled. So the simple dividing factor I was saying, it's either about the power of love, of unity here, or it's about the love of power, right, which is dominion over. Okay. Let me just see what the... All right, okay, I just see a little question that popped up. Just to clarify, in astrology, is Venus the only planet that travels between the worlds? No, Venus and Mercury are inferior planets, meaning they travel in the inner solar system between the Earth and the Sun. And Mercury and Venus are both represented in mythology as intermediaries between the worlds. Mercury is associated, Mercury Hermes is associated as a psychopomp, a guide to the soul of the dead, souls of the dead. And I think I have something I'm going to talk about that a little later. But as far as when I was talking about the Ida Pingala and the Sushumna central channel, that central channel, which is the mediating principle between the duality, the uniting factor, can be associated with both Mercury and Venus. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Okay, so just a little bit about Venus, because you have to understand this. There's such a perfection with Venus that this was not missed, and this is what's carried forward in the Western mystery traditions when we get into, say, Masonism, Masonic traditions, or those ancient rites that the Canaanites knew, the ancient secret Canaanite rites that were carried through the Temple of Solomon and then later into the Masonic traditions, and then we get into the whole Templar thing, etc. So basically, Venus orbits the sun 13 times in 8 years. Okay, 13-8 is the golden ratio. So Venus orbits the sun in less days than the Earth orbits the sun, which creates this ratio of 8 to 13. This is a Fibonacci number, or just expressed in decimal, it's pi. If you don't get it yet, you will. Thus, 5 conjunctions of the Earth and Venus, what I was showing you before, occur every 8 orbits of the Earth around the sun, and every 13 orbits of Venus around the sun on her own, because she does this in less time than the Earth. So it takes the Earth 8 years and it takes Venus 13 years. This 5, 8, 13 are successive numbers in the Fibonacci series. And the Fibonacci series is tied into this pi and the golden mean, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But for example, the 1 plus 1 equals 2, and then the sum of, the sum of this plus the next number equals 3, and then the sum of this plus the next number equals 5, so on and so forth, infinite. So these sums of the number with the previous number before it are what are called the Fibonacci series. There's a perfection of mathematics in that. And Venus, through her 13-8 golden ratio cycle and then her 5 conjunctions, expresses this. Okay, and then Then we have understanding. Now, I want you to remember the stretching of the cord that I talked about, that rod and that line, because this is some of what is built into these ancient temples. And yes, definitely carried forward through Egypt and Greece and Rome. Okay, let's unpack this. This is the golden mean, the golden ratio. So here it is expressed in, I hope, simple terms so you can get it. Well, let me walk you through this. The ratio of the length of this entire line A to the larger length of this segment B is the same as, hope you're following me, the ratio of the length of the larger B to C. And it's only at this point, which is the 1/6 expressed, it's only at this point where that happens. Oh, whoops, I mean to go back. It's only at this point that this happens. So that this ratio, again, the ratio of this entire line is to the length of this line. I think I said that wrong. The ratio of the length of this line to the length of the larger line of B is the same as the ratio of B is to C, right? So you can see it. And again, it's only at this point where it happens. This is this magical point in the line that's called the golden mean. It only happens. So again, it's this ratio. Yeah. Okay, so this is built in, this is a foundation of sacred geometry. And this is part of what that measurement is, as I was saying before, the stretching of the cord, the ritual of the stretching of the cord. And also, again, associated with the perfection of the planet Venus because of her pentangle form here. Every bar on the line of the pentangle is an expression of the golden mean, right? What you saw before. So you see the perfection of that. Here's the golden mean expressed in ratio, and here it is. And every single portion of this line is this. Now, to take it one step further, the sun to Venus to Earth distances, or Earth to Venus to sun, is also the same proportion. It's the golden mean. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Okay. Just trying to think if I have, hold on a second. I don't think, no, I'm going to go back. Okay. All right, so let me try to nutshell this, because wow, now I have to go through all of the Western mystery traditions, but I'm going to use the Masons. Like I said, these ancient Canaanite rites had to do, like I said, he wanted to build the temple to Astarte, who is the light of Venus, and all of that process of enlightenment and all of that belonged to Inanna is carried forward into Astarte. The Canaanites were known for their secret rites. They had words where they could raise the dead. Remember when I talked about Venus shining into Newgrange, that even then, and in that separate tradition, yet concurrent cultures, that Venus also was associated, even in the Celtic times, with the resurrection of the dead. It's only, and it's purported that Jesus was a part of this Canaanite ancient mystery lineage, right? And now, if you think of Inanna's story and you think of Jesus's story, in the Bible, they associate Jesus with the morning star. Like I had said, the later Semite traditions associate more with the morning star than the evening star, and they make it masculine. And of course, it said that Jesus was able to raise the dead, right? Just like Isis did to Osiris, right? Just like Inanna represented the power of death and rebirth. So in modern, well, ancient, as it carried through the ancient wisdom traditions, it can be unpacked through the Masonic tradition, because the building of the Temple of Solomon is exactly what the Masons are doing in their lodges and in their rites. The layout of every Masonic temple is laid to be a model of Solomon's temple. And here's the interesting, one of the highest rites of the Masonic order happens, it's called the raising of the Master Mason. And he's killed ritually, and then he's reborn specifically to the pre-dawn light of the rising of Venus at a certain symbolic equinox. So the rising of Venus also being central to Canaanite theology, going back through Solomon's temple and the Shekinah and Astarte, is associated the same way it is in resurrection in Freemasonry, excuse me, which is the third degree, the making of a Master Mason. The symbolic death of the Master Mason and resurrection happens in the temple, and they ritually kill him. And then when he's raised, what they call the raising of the Master Mason, he is symbolically held in what they call a 5-point embrace. And then he's lifted as arisen, and he's pointed back to the tomb where he was, where they say to him to look at this tomb, and he's pointed to the east where there's a 5-point star blazing in between these two pillars called Boaz and Jachin. That's a whole other story, but it's a part of the Temple of Solomon. It's also the two pillars of the tree of life, if you want to follow the mystic tradition through, through the Kabbalah. It's the Kabbalistic tree of life. So from this moment when the Mason is raised and pointed to Venus blazing, he's told this is the bright morning star, and she's just risen ahead of the sun, and he is then considered to be a raised Mason. Sounds a little bit like the king-making ceremony, right? But again, the building of the temple in Masonic tradition, and this is where we can glimpse perhaps some of what was going on in those ancient mysteries. Excuse me, I need a drink of water. Where we can glimpse a little of what's going on in those Masonic traditions, because the building of the temple is the recreation, and they have series of initiations you go through. It's the recreation and the enlightenment of one's own psyche in harmony with the divine. In other words, to bring oneself into the golden mean, like Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, right, with the 5-pointed star. This includes, like I said, all of those things we saw before, the rebirthing of oneself, deconditioning, shadow work, the incorporation of living by spiritual values, the alchemical processes that we talked about. So to a certain degree, it's understood and been carried through in the mystery traditions that it's the great mother that births the human form, but it's Venus that births the spiritual form. And it's through all of these different reconciliations of polarities within oneself that happens. In New Age terms, there's something about this building the light body. They call it the Merkaba. It's the same thing. Okay, so the Templars are also, we can get into the whole Templar thing and how they held the holy of the holies, the inner traditions within the church. They were accused of worshiping this head, and which is a whole other story, and the Black Madonnas, which is Isis, right? It's Venus, the Black Madonna, and also, the consort, Mary Magdalene and Jesus. This is supposedly held at the core of the Templar mysteries, which is, an earlier predecessor of the Masons. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead. I mean, because we have, where are we on time?
Not very much left.
Yeah,
well, let's see. No, we do.
Yeah.
A little bit,
Okay.
if you want.
Well, I have a couple points, and then I want to tie it all into the astrology of it, just briefly, like how we might be looking at Venus differently in our own charts and people's charts. So I can't get into this much. But I do want to point out the association of Lady Liberty with Venus is very strong because Lady Liberty was a gift to us by the French Freemasons through the government of France, not the government of France. She was created by Bartholdi, who was a French Mason. And when he sailed to the U.S. to envision, he had no vision of what he thought that the Statue of Liberty would look like. So he came over to the New World a few times to figure it out. And when he sailed into New York Harbor and past Bedloe Island, which is where she resides right now, he had a vision, like a flash of lightning. And he said he saw this great vision of a magnificent goddess, like Nimrod's Semiramis or Isis or Astarte, holding aloft a torch of illuminism in one hand and welcoming all visitors to the land of freedom and opportunity. It was right then when he had that vision that he sketched her out. Her original name was Liberty Enlightening the World. I could tell you a whole story because I've been meditating with Lady Liberty ever since election night. I don't want to get political, but the night of the election, I instantly went to the Lady Liberty because to me, she represents the soul of our land. And based on all the things that I just told you, right? The soul of our land, what she represents. So I went to her because I wanted to see through her eyes what is going on. And I also wanted to offer her my love and empowerment. And she's been a daily meditation of mine. In fact, I bought a representation, a beautiful white Statue of Liberty that stands next to my Venus. I have a early 19th century Venus that's also holding above the light, very much like this. I should have put her picture in there, my statue, and they're standing together because her original name was Liberty Enlightening the World. And in fact, when she was installed on the pedestal, because she was given to us by the French Freemasons, but we had to fund the pedestal. It was Pulitzer the Pulitzer, who actually got the money to fund. He held an auction and so on and so forth to fund the building of the pedestal to hold her. The Grand Masters of the Masons are the ones who consecrated in traditional Masonic rites the pedestal on which she stands. And I want to read to you these words that they said at the consecration of that pedestal. And think about this as our time. Massive as the statue is, its physical proportions sink into comparative obscurity when contrasted with the nobility of its concept. Liberty enlightening the world, how lofty the thought. To be free is the first and noblest aspiration of the human breath, and it is now a universally admitted truth that only in proportion as people become possessed of liberty do they become enlightened, civilized, and useful. As Masons, we cannot appropriate to ourselves alone the lessons which this monument will teach. Not only to us, but to all people it will appeal. The gigantic figure which is here to stand in unapproachable grandeur, while the centuries pass, will command, be noble, and the nobleness that lies in others, that is sleeping but never dead, will rise in majesty to meet thine own. That was the intention she was consecrated with. And then this poem by Emma Lazarus, which was part of the auction that was offered in the auction that, excuse me, Pulitzer had. She was a Jewish poet, Jewish woman of a large immigrant Jewish family. And she saw Lady Liberty as the mother of exiles, and she wrote this poem, which only years later became emblazoned on the pedestal and associated with her in this latter part of it. We know, forgive me, you're tired, you're weary. But in her poem, which is interesting, she is separating also liberty from Greece, because it's called the New Colossus, and rather than what she's referring to is Helios, who was a wonder of the ancient world, straddling the Bay of Rhodes. And that's what she's saying here, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs, astride from land to land, but here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So the image here is one of the nurturing, a symbol of nurturing and hope to those, as Emma Lazarus herself, from a family of immigrants, saw her spirit as the spirit of this goddess, which again to me represents the true soul of our nation. So anyway, okay, on to a little bit of the astrology of this, and we'll tie it up. Okay. I'm not going to go over all of this because it's actually quite complicated, because we can talk about the energy of the oppositions and the energy of the quincunxes that are formed here naturally by the natural rulers of these signs. So what we're looking at here is Mars is ruler of Aries, Venus is ruler of Taurus, and then again Venus is ruler of Libra, and then ancient ruler Mars and new ruler Pluto, more modern ruler of Scorpio. So what's interesting, first thing that you see is that these two are these primordial manifestations of me, right? Me, the primordial expression of will. Aries, Mars, is severed from the cosmic womb here. This is Namu. This is the primordial ocean, right? This is the energy of separation. And Mars is the sword that cuts that umbilical cord. It's the knife that cuts that umbilical cord. And we fall out of the cosmic amniotic fluid of Pisces into separative identity. This is the first primordial push of that. From there, that identity then takes root and turns inward and flourishes, right? Like Taurus. It goes down. It's like the root searching for the water to get its survival needs met, our basic needs. This is and also our inner resources. So we have the development of the personal self. Let's say that the perfection of the ego self that is then born, taking all the elements of body, mind, and spirit, and they coalesce in the human womb in Cancer, and the human child appears. And it's all of these building blocks of elements that then go and cause us to come to this cusp. Now, what's interesting here, back to what Tegan was asking, it's right at this cusp of the descendant where we find, and I don't have it here, but it's Mercury ruling Virgo, where we have the two intermediaries, right? The two liminal, the two liminal gods and goddesses, right? The ones that pass between the worlds. So what's happening here is symbolically, right? If we look at evolution of consciousness, this is the development of the little s self that I was talking about. And on the descendant here, it's transferred to the higher S self, the transpersonal self. So here we're building in developmental psychology, we're building the building blocks of our personal self. And here is where we are initiated into the other, at something that's greater than us here. And it becomes increasingly transpersonal as we move on. and again, this doesn't mean that one sign is more evolved than the other. It's just a model of an evolution of consciousness. So we have Mercury and as ruler of Virgo, and Venus as ruler of Libra, occupying this descendant cusp where the transference of the personal self to the higher self happens, which is also mirrored in the spiritual process of evolution that we call the path of return, or is called the path of return in ancient mysteries, where you are consciously then working on yourself to return to that place so that you are no longer on the wheel of incarnation and you have achieved enlightenment. So these two liminal archetypes are the ones that transfer us there. Okay, so when we talk about the inner side of Venus here as ruler, here's some things I want you to think about. I'm just wrapping up a lot of what I talked about from part 1 and part 2, and I'm putting it into how might this change the way that we look at Venus in our charts and in someone else's chart. So there's questions I would ask, right? I would say that one of the questions of the inner side of Venus relating to the principle of parthenogenesis that I talked to you about in the earliest forms of the really, really archaic form of Venus, 500,000 years or more, what do we create from ourselves alone? Right? That is the principle of parthenogenesis. What can you bring out of yourself alone? So I want you to take these questions and re-look at Venus in your chart in this way. How do we love ourselves? Because this inner form of Venus is so intimately and intricately, not only by quincunx, but by opposition, tied into, and we know it, it's an axiom, we say it all the time, you know, you can't love somebody else unless you love yourself. The relationship you have with yourself is the relationship you have with somebody else. There it is in quincunx, right? In inconjunct. And here it is to a certain degree in opposition. But the point that I'm making about relationship here, to me, I wrote this in my book and I still stand by it. Venus is ruler of Libra when it comes to relationship is the flirtation. It's the allure of the other. It's the kind of, ooh, the attraction. It's all of that, what we know as Yang Venus, right? Or what we would know as the principles of Venus Aphrodite. She's the worm on the hook. When you bite and you get into the relationship, here you're in Scorpio territory, right? Because here you're talking about shared resources. It's like I say, shared bank accounts, right? You know, you're sharing a home, you're getting married, you're merging your resources, your personal resources and their personal resources. You know, so here we still have the dance of the you and me and the other and what I want and what you want. And, you know, we can imagine what all, it's an air sign, remember, we can imagine what all of these things are. But when we step into Scorpio territory, this is where intimate relationship this is where intimate relationship is formed. And then we add in the archetype of Pluto here, where it becomes, like I said before, you know, it becomes a titanic battle between the lower will, Mars, and higher will, Pluto. And in these kinds of relationships, you might want to call them soulmate relationships or karmic relationships, growth is being forced to happen because they are deeply transformative relationships that are coming from your soul, right? So we have my resources and your resources cause us to go into a feeling of you're mine, I'm yours, and getting to the bottom line of what do I really need from you? What do you really need from me? And then the bigger question is, what does my soul need? That then as you do more of this conscious path of return, that becomes more of something that informs the way you relate not only to yourself, but to others. So again, thinking of the Scorpio-Taurus polarity here, this second, 8th house polarity, as I said, how do we love ourselves? Because that's going to show up in how we relate to others. Another question here is, what do we need to descend into? thinking of Inanna's descent journey, right? Or to a certain degree, you can look at your Venus by house, sign, and aspect, and it can show you what may constitute descent for you. What are the archetypes there? What are the qualities of those house, sign, and aspects may show you exactly what's disowned within your own consciousness, or the operative way in which descent may be enacted in your life. Another question for this inner side of Venus: what do we need to marry or unite within ourselves, right? What is your own inner marriage that needs to happen? What parts of your inner world and outer world are not congruent? And this is I've done this. I do this exercise frequently, like every couple years. For women, who is your animus? Do you have an image of your animus? Do you know him? Have you met him? Have you worked with him? That is the work of the inner marriage. For men, who's your anima? Have you met her? You can journey to her. This is what I was saying. I do this exercise every couple years to check in with how my animus has changed. In one point in my life, early in my life, he was a tracker. He was like one of those native you could drop him anywhere and he could scent and just know everything, read the breeze, and it was so perfect for the amount of travel that I do because he helps me be out in the world, right? That animus tracker is a part of how I'm able to navigate an unknown terrain. I mean, there's a lot more to him, but when I met him, I was interested. So you can set up a journey yourself where you may want to go to a place of nature and meet your own animus, meet your own anima. I did this with a group out in Seattle when I spoke at the Washington Astrological. We did a lot of experiential stuff on this chart, all the stuff I'm talking about. We looked at our values and we did anima, animus journeys, etc. It's something to think about. It's something that you can do. Another thing about, just a few more points, another thing about the inner side of Venus here: what are you holding on to, right, that needs to be let go of? Because that's the Scorpio polarity, right? That's Pluto looking over here going, stamping his foot. What are you going to let go of? If you're really going to make that descent, if you're really going to strip away like Inanna did, and you really want to find out, because here's the mystery of that. This is one of the feminine mysteries too. One of the mysteries of that is that the things that we identify with, that we think we are, these possessions here, are not who we truly are, and we don't discover what we really value until we let go of some of those things that are most precious to us. And further to that, as Venus is ruler of Taurus, we don't understand or really get in touch with our own value, right, until we can start to let go of some of those things that we have identified ourselves through those possessions, those trappings. Because just one more point here, because Venus is ruler of Libra, and a lot of times, and Enid and I were talking about this in the beginning, that instantly people look at their Venus and their chart and they start talking about relationships. I would question you as astrologers that when somebody comes to you to talk to you about relationships, the first question you should ask them is, how is their relationship with themselves, right? When people talk to you about their creativity being blocked, look at their Venus. When people talk about meaninglessness, right, because we were talking about that, the loss of the creative, this parthenogenesis, what we can bring from ourselves, by ourselves, of ourselves alone, we are largely estranged from that. Not always, but as culture, right, there's this whole codependency that we look at, that this is the model. This being alone, being self-sufficient, not so much. That's not the model. But there's principles here. So when somebody comes and talks to you about meaninglessness, look at their Venus. When their creativity is blocked, look at their Venus, right? Because that, like Tagore was saying, without that creative power, all of our actions are hollow. they are meaningless, right? And that's one of the pathologies of our society, because the feminine has been so stripped out of it, or the feminine power, specifically of sexual choice, which is here. That's big in the news today. Again, who would have thought? So like I said, when people come and talk to you or ask you about relationship, examine their Venus first and think about it as what is their relationship to themselves before you get into what is their relationship with others. How much are they intimately intertwined and knowing themselves? And you think about it for yourself in that way. I mean, I've done it myself, and I mean, I can tell you why I'm delivering this material to you. I have a Venus and Scorpio in the 8th house, opposite Persephone in Taurus in the 2nd. The asteroid Persephone. So there you go, right? I have a pure play archetype, but I've done this examination, you know, of the archetypes of Venus, what constitutes descent for me in the Scorpio archetype. You know, do I have this deep relationship with myself? Do I trust myself? Do I abandon myself? You know, do I blah, blah, blah. Okay, and with all of those descent questions in mind, one can look to the polarity point of Venus wherever she is in your chart, and you ask these inner questions now. And the polarity point, as Jeffrey Wolf Green always said, to move from karma to dharma is to move to the polarity point. So then that can be true of any planet in the chart. So to move to the polarity point of Venus is then to understand a point of evolution about your own evolutionary growth, you know. So for me, like I was giving you my example of Venus and Scorpio in the 8th, the polarity point is, well, it's Persephone, in Taurus in the 2nd house. So for me, you know, some personal growth has meant about really grounding myself in my self-sufficiency, really slowing down, letting it be gentle. You know, I'm still working on that one because I'm a Pluto Virgo in the 6th house, so I'm a workaholic. So I'm still working on that one, but you know, the pleasures, the sweet, simple pleasures of life, right? Okay, so I think that brings us pretty close to where we want to end, and I just want to see if there's any questions or anything anybody wants to bring up. You can unmute yourselves if you want.
Everyone's probably digesting.
They're
comments of, love this.
Yeah. They're typing away. Feel free to unmute yourselves.
Amazing information, Patricia. Thank you so much.
Oh, and this is Lynn Carroll. I never say your name right. I'm sorry, Lynn. Rivera, who also goes by the name Inanna. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you taught me some things about Inanna tonight, so thank you.
Excellent.
Oh, here's one. Why is Venus in Virgo usually seen as negative, not as a seductress?
Well, I don't know who made that interpretation. Who made that interpretation? I mean, Venus in Virgo to me has so many, just like the inner side of Mercury in Virgo, it's so much of the mysteries of the alchemical process, right? So I guess I would say that in as much as Venus in Virgo is doing her inner work, is going to be directly in relation to how much that light is shown that then becomes the power of the lure, right? But, you know, Virgo is, okay, classically, you know, it's seen as being humble and hiding the light and so on and so forth. But, you know, I could go on about the esoteric and the mystical traditions around Virgo and what that represents also. But yeah, anyway. I wouldn't say that's not necessarily true. I would say there could be a very deep magnetic because of that humility, because of the hiding of the light. It's like people would want to draw people that are tuned in. Again, I'm talking, if you're doing your inner work and you're radiating that vibe, people would want to go, ooh, this is a safe place to enter into this temple that's being built here, and it's soft, and it's humble, it's approachable. Okay. So, all right. Thank you, Isabel. So much to process. Yes, you'll probably have to watch it again. Lots of information. Okay, everyone. So, Enid, should we wrap it up here?
I think so. This was quite wonderful. I am so pleased that you decided to hold this one.
Well, yeah, because the thing is, delivering it in two parts, it can be a little disjointed, because by the end of part one, until you've seen it weave through, you're kind of like, yeah, what does that mean? And they really belong together, but it's too much information to do in just one part.
I think that the brain would basically be fried by the end of a 4-hour.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, actually, I thought it was quite wonderful to think about all the stuff from the first part, and then I was really looking forward to having a chance to monitor this today.
Right. Well, you see how it carries through then. I mean, it's quite amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
I mean, 800,000 perhaps years of history, right? That this archetype, emerges out of our Paleolithic consciousness.
Mm-hmm. The pieces we don't pay attention to, and they still play such a large role.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they're there, and unfortunately subsumed much in our society today. And but
yeah,
again, why I think her story needs to be told.
Well, it looks to me like in our society today, perhaps her story is going to start getting told again.
Again, exactly.
From the Women's March. Oh,
exactly.
I loved some of those signs. I can't believe we're still doing this.
Oh, I love the granny. The granny, she's like, I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit. Yeah. Okay, well, everybody, keep Lady Liberty in your meditations, because she is holding the light of Venus. She is holding the feminine sacred traditions as part of the soul of our country as we prepare for our Pluto return, right? Which is, to me, the initiation and soul making of our country. It's our first major initiation as a country. And it is a revelation of souls. So part of what we see going on is all building up to that point. Eventually, I'll be putting all of that together in another, because I'm lecturing that at UAC, and I forget, I'm lecturing other places about this. What is the Pluto return in the U.S. chart? So hold the light, everyone, and continue to send your love and encouragement to Lady Liberty.
Well, thank you again, and thank you everyone who attended. I'll try to get this recording out as quick as I can.
Okay, thank you. I recorded it also, Enid, so.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
I always like being paranoid with computers.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.